After 4 years of full-time conscientious startup, during which we went slow to go fast, taking our time to set our sights on a North Star, and cobbling together just enough resources to keep our organizers door knocking and calling, and providing pizza and childcare at our meetings, the summer of 2005 through the spring of 2007 were 2 watershed years for CADRE. Although we knew it had taken our time to get to this point, centering our core parent leaders in our decision-making, we did not quite expect that all of our deliberate patience would pay off so soon. On the heels of our core parents adopting the human rights framework, we spent the following summer and fall on 2 major projects that set us on a course to our future. We set out designing and piloting a bilingual human rights training for CADRE parents, as well as coordinating a human rights documentation project, entailing focus groups across different youth and parent organizations across Los Angeles. We did all of this in close collaboration with Partners for Dignity and Rights, known as the National Economic Social Rights Initiative, or NESRI, at the time. This was a major undertaking for our small staff, and also meant that CADRE began to convene other organizations to collect as many stories as possible regarding human rights violations and how youth and parents were experiencing public education. We specifically listened for conditions and actions leading to the pushout of students and families from schools. We started off by collecting our own core parent leaders analysis and articulating it as a position statement to guide our framing, messaging, and action research going forward. As we trained grassroots South LA Black and Brown parents in human rights and observed their resonance with parents, we gained confidence that we were on the right track. Human rights were much more readily claimed by everyone, regardless of circumstance, and covered every aspect of existence. The intersectionality of human rights and their violations made sense. Surviving intergenerational poverty and racialized exclusion created a daily existence that felt like a house of cards ready to fall at any moment. While we trained, we also designed. CADRE was going to do our own documentation project of school pushout and human rights violations, which would culminate in a people's hearing in the spring of 2006. We wanted to counter the notion that there was a dropout crisis, and instead publicly educate and assert that in fact it was a pushout crisis. Our organizers, as well as some of our core parents, went door to door on dozens of South LA blocks, cold calling to see if anyone in that household had experienced a school suspension. There was no shortage of willing storytellers. Parents assumed we wanted to speak to their children, but we actually wanted to hear the parent's story, to hear how a suspension impacted the entire family and their relationship with the school afterwards. These gateway conversations at the door helped us identify a pool of South LA parents who we then asked for longer interviews. At the same time, we developed a survey for youth who had already been pushed out and were attending continuation, community day, or alternative schools. We ended up collecting over 50 parent interviews and over 30 youth surveys. The reframing of dropout as pushout was not difficult because the stories told the truth. Some stories were egregious. Most were about small, seemingly administrative but racially biased actions by educators and administrators that had the cumulative effect of pushing a student out of school. Students were often emotionally pushed out well before they were physically removed or asked to leave school. We broke new ground by designing ways to have our parents collectively analyze this rich data, regardless of literacy or language. We translated all of our findings to create a bilingual English-Spanish data set, and with the initial analysis from our core parents during bi-weekly Friday night meetings, we held several additional house meetings to have our parent members further prioritize the findings and testimonies that we would feature at the CADRE People's Hearing. Throughout this process, the most important thing taking place was the political awareness that parents were gaining. The political awareness that school pushout was a common Black and Brown experience and outcome. Our core parent leaders had named the most egregious manifestation of anti-Blackness in schools, pushout through school discipline, criminalization, and policing. Yet we had clear evidence that the template was being applied readily to Brown students. It was the next level to CADRE's foundation for building Black and Brown solidarity. It was a clear example of Angela Davis's wise words, "If they come for me in the morning, they will come for you in the night." Our participatory analysis culminated in the first ever community-led People's Hearing on school pushout, which we held on June 14, 2006, at Kedron Community Health Center in Watts. It was attended by over 100 people, featured 10 Black and Brown testimonies shared by parents and youth, after which we had responses from School Board Member-elect Monica Garcia, Gompers Middle School classroom teacher Kirti Baranwal, and legal aid attorney Dorothy Herrera. It was a profound form of courageous truth-telling and a huge milestone. Leading up to our People's Hearing, CADRE had also learned of an effort by forward-thinking champions inside LAUSD to shift the district to having a behavioral support framework as an alternative to the harmful application of zero tolerance at school sites. Based on the framework known as School-Wide Positive Behavioral Intervention and Supports, or SWP/S, this policy proposal presented an unexpected opportunity, and we could not have been more ready to take advantage of it. Originally, after publicly presenting demands for how to change school discipline at the People's Hearing, we had planned to influence 1 to 2 South LA schools to work with CADRE to change their practices, after which we would then use these pilots to go district-wide. But this policy proposal represented an opportunity for us to go district-wide immediately. While we wanted to hold out for something much more progressive, such as restorative justice, our parents determined that putting CADRE's weight behind the SWP/S policy proposal would establish a new starting point from which parents could hold schools accountable when unjust discipline was handed out. SWP/S had accountability rules for everybody at a school site and would give parents incredible new leverage to begin challenging discriminatory practices. Immediately after the People's Hearing and before the 2005-2006 school year ended, we held a mini protest in front of the LAUSD board. There was no meeting agenda item, but we wanted to let the district know that we were demanding a change before the district framed the issue on their terms. And that's how we shifted from documentation and community-led testimony to our first ever policy campaign. Our rich repository of documentation gave us an advantage. No group had collected so much family-level evidence of unjust, racially discriminatory school discipline, and no community, let alone parent organizing group, had rolled the dice to turn these stories into a grassroots campaign for district-wide policy change, reframing school discipline as pushout, illuminating the racially disproportionate outcome data, and naming the school-to-prison pipeline as the result. We continued to strategize how to win this campaign, and went to school board meetings in the fall of 2006 into the winter of 2007, keeping tabs on when the SWP/S policy would be up for a board vote. We helped edit and revise the policy. We lent our support at community-wide meetings. At the time, LAUSD was also under pressure to rectify being out of compliance with their special education consent decree. Thousands of the Black students suspended were special ed students. This gave us even more leverage. At board meetings, we signed up for public comment and our parent leaders shared testimony. By doing so, we created a public forum and shaped the debate before anyone else did. On one of those occasions in late January 2007, an LA Times reporter was in the boardroom and heard our parents' testimonies. He followed us out and asked one of our parent leaders who testified if she would be open to an in-depth interview. We were gearing up for a huge protest in front of the district on February 13, 2007, when the board decided it was going to vote on whether to adopt SWP/S. We were meeting with school board members and counting votes. We had solicited and collected letters from children's rights advocates, including juvenile court judges from around the country, praising what LAUSD was about to do in adopting SWP/S. We were mobilizing youth and parents from our sibling organizations to turn out with us. We saw this as a chance to create a much more collective course for calling out school pushout and finally for decriminalizing our schools. The LA Times story dropped February 12th on the front page of the Metro section above the fold. Miraculously, it featured and centered CADRE's perspective and one of our core parent leaders and her son's story. It was the day before the vote, and millions of people learned about the SWP/S policy from our point of view. On February 13, 2007, we mobilized nearly 150 people, calling out LAUSD for school pushout and demanding the adoption of SWP/S. TV news cameras and reporters were on hand. In the middle of the agenda item, in the middle of the debate, the president of the teachers union marched in and demanded that the discussion be halted immediately and that the vote be postponed for 2 weeks until its members had a chance to review the policy. Despite our consistent outreach to UTLA, even putting letters of support in teachers' mailboxes at school sites, it was claimed that the UN had no idea about the policy proposal. We were determined to make sure this was only a temporary setback. We had numerous emergency meetings with the UTLA Executive Cabinet to get their buy-in and set out to remobilize another large turnout 2 weeks later on February 27. While we had to concede some wording, and we knew that the teachers' union had their own reasons for supporting SWP-BIS that were not the same as ours, we headed to victory. On February 27th, LAUSD, in a unanimous vote, adopted SWP-BIS as its new foundational policy. It was a policy victory felt around the country. LAUSD, the second largest district in the country after New York City, became the very first major urban school district to adopt a district-wide school discipline framework that guided school staff and classroom teachers at each grade level on what was expected in terms of preventative behavioral support and age and developmentally appropriate interventions. It mandated that each school conduct an audit of its SWP-BIS compliance on an annual basis, and it gave parents, our parents, the long-sought leverage that we needed to challenge even negative classroom environments that often were the precursor to unjust school discipline. And all that human rights training and those focus groups that we did nearly 2 years earlier, immediately following our game-changing victory in March and April of 2007, we jointly published our first ever national report called Deprived of Dignity, chronicling harsh, unjust school discipline in New York City and Los Angeles, and their human rights implications. And we put out a training manual specifically geared to support educational justice organizers in building a human rights vision for our public schools. Watershed years. It had taken 6 arduous years to get to this momentous point. It took a while and it came quickly, all at the same time. It was the first notch in our belt, which our core parent leaders felt was vital to get. It also cemented our DNA. Tune in to our next video in this series for how we leveraged our first policy victory to help catalyze a national movement to end the school-to-prison pipeline.